Welcome back to the study of the book of Daniel. Last week we covered an introduction and the first 7 verses of chapter 1. Today we'll cover the final 14 verses of the first chapter. Recall the kingdom of Judah and its capital city of Jerusalem had been conquered by the Babylonians, the king Nebuchadnezzar. It appears around 605 BC. The Babylonians are the most powerful empire in that entire region. They not only conquered and controlled the Jewish divided kingdom of both Judah and Israel, they also have crushed the Assyrians and taken their major city of Nineveh to the north, and defeated the Egyptians also when they had come north to try to challenge them. Let's take a look at that map. The mighty Babylonians at this time controlled all the territory from the Egyptian border to the south west, all the way east to the Persian Gulf. Their empire will span over 100 years. As we looked at last week, they basically controlled the food basket of this entire region, this, quote, civilized western region, which is called the Fertile Crescent, which included the rich river lands of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River to the west, and the Tigris up more towards the north, and Euphrates to the east. That surrounded all the rich land that surrounded the Arabian and the Syrian deserts. After their successful siege of Jerusalem, the Babylonians took not only a large tax payment from the people, they took articles from the temple, but they also took some of the best educated, the brightest young men from the royal and noble families, and shipped these kids back to the capital city of Babylon. They were to be trained to become future advisors to King Nebuchadnezzar. These were dark days for the Jewish people. We know that one of these teenage boys was named Daniel. When our curtain opens in verse 8, we'll see that Daniel and his 3 companions are now back in this magnificent city of Babylon. Babylon was located on Euphrates River, which is pretty close to modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. The city was said to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The historian Herodotus described Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon as massive and magnificent, with miles of 300 feet high walls that surrounded the city and a moat that also encircled the entire city. Many of these walls were terraced with tiered hanging gardens containing a variety of trees and vines and waterfalls that were serviced by hydraulic pumps from the Euphrates River. Imagine, it must have been a shock to Daniel and his companions to see the size and the splendor of this worldly city. Babylon itself was an ancient city. It dates all the way back to the book of Genesis. It's always been a place that symbolized man's pride and hostility towards God. The prophet Isaiah in 13:19 described Babylon as the glory of all kingdoms, full of splendor and pomp. Pomp there meaning full of pride and sin. He compared it to Sodom and Gomorrah. It was also recalled the locations in the book of Genesis of the Tower of Babel, where man had rejected God, and they were full of pride and attempted to erect this tower, this massive tower, to honor what? Themselves. And also in the last book, in the book of Revelation, Babylon is always associated with the Antichrist. It's a city that is void of God. This is the place that Daniel and his companions will live for the rest of their lives, in this, quote, worldly city. They're expected to forget their old ways, their old God, and embrace this new world with pomp and human wisdom. He and his friends have traveled over 1,000 miles from their humble, defeated Judah to this mighty city. We learned last week that Daniel's godly name had been changed to Belshazzar, a name that honors the Babylonian god Baal, B-A-L, Baal. Daniel and his three companions are to undergo 3 years of intense education, or maybe indoctrination, in Babylonian culture and literature and language, and training into Babylonian black arts, the occult, to become soothsayers and advisors to the king's court. They are being groomed as what? As wise men, as magi, advisors in the service of the king. Their university education will include both room and board, including even food and wine, we learned last week, from the king's own table. Daniel and his companions are going to have to make some decisions about how to navigate in this new world. Daniel, fortunately, and his friends had grown up in the court of the righteous king of Judah, which is Josiah, who came from the line of David. And David also grew up in a time during the major prophet Jeremiah. He had witnessed the rejection of the people and the king after Josiah, that he rejected the warnings of Jeremiah. And he had seen the truth of those prophecies unfold. Let's take a look at 1 Chronicles. The people of Judah were exiled to Babylon. Why? Because they were unfaithful to the Lord. They had rejected his warnings and rejected his prophets. The people of Judah had chosen to walk away from God, and now they're experiencing the consequences of that decision. They had walked away from God's blessings. Indeed, these were dark days for the Jewish people. Daniel had seen all this. He had seen his country, his people, his family, his temple completely taken over by this powerful king. Given the circumstances, Daniel had every reason to be depressed, angry, to give up, and to give in. Daniel was facing the same decisions that you and I face every day during times of stress. Do we continue to follow and trust God, even when life doesn't make much sense? Do we trust in his word? Do we trust in his promises? Do we trust in his plan? Do we trust in his presence? Do we trust in his sovereignty in those times when the world is just against us? Or do we allow our circumstances to determine whether or not the size of our faith? Do we allow our circumstances to determine our hope? Do we allow our circumstances to basically drive our decisions? We'll see how Daniel answered those questions in verse 8. And this verse 8 is the key to the entire book of Daniel. Let's take a look. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's food or wine. So he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself. Then in the New King James, we get a little different translation that's, I think, helpful. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he, meaning the king, drank. I love that expression, purposed in his heart. It's a Hebrew expression meaning to make a heartfelt, solemn decision. Daniel was making more than a decision about some dietary issue. He was purposely, the literal term there is set his heart to remain faithful to God. He had no power to rule over or do anything against these powerful Babylonians, but he did have the capacity to decide about his faith. He couldn't change his circumstances, but he could change his heart. Imagine how much that decision pleased God. Daniel would prove to be God's ambassador in this quote-unquote hostile world throughout his life. Daniel was never alone. And like all good Jewish boys, he also had the promises of the Old Testament that he had memorized and studied as a child. From the book of Psalms, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Be still, meaning do not be anxious. Be still and know that I am God. Again, you are my refuge and shield. I have put my hope in your word, in your promises. Daniel, this young teenage boy, chose in his heart to trust God. He trusted that his God was, quote, bigger than this Babylon. Every time you and I purposely in our heart put our trust in God, especially when things and circumstantially doesn't look like we should, we strengthen that muscle, our muscle of faith. We grow spiritually in maturity and confidence. And God will honor that trust. And he will always fulfill his promises. That's what we'll see in Daniel's life. Daniel every day will live to see God fulfill those promises. He'll even see the king of Babylon bow to his God. And he'll live long enough to see that the people that are exiled, his people of Judah, that are exiled to Babylon, will be released exactly like God had promised. Also notice in verse 8 that Daniel tells the senior official something he probably did not want to hear, that this food, this magnificent, fine food that you're offering me will defile me. To defile means to pollute or to stain, to make you unclean. It also means that you're compromising or desecrating. These foods perhaps were probably against the Jewish dietary laws and maybe even had been blessed by the pagan gods. But this was such a bold declaration on the part of Daniel to, quote, insult the king's food. What is the likely expectation from this official? What would you have expected? That this teenage boy, this captive, has rejected the king's finest food. Food is always important in a culture. It's always unique. The likely response from that official, quote, should have been, eat it or eat nothing. But that's not what happened. Let's take a look at verse 9 and see the grace of God places God's hand on this official's heart. Now God had granted Daniel favor and compassion, meaning grace, from the chief official. But he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking thinner than those of the other young men your age? You would endanger my head before the king. So this official does not react negatively to Daniel's request. He miraculously exercises grace, which is described here as compassion and favor. God had opened the eyes and heart of this official to see the sincerity and the courage in Daniel's commitment to his faith. Perhaps a lesson we all can learn in how to navigate within a non-believing world. The official's response also comes from the heart. He's understanding and sympathetic, but he's saying, I cannot take the risk. It'd be fatal to me. If you four guys look unhealthy compared to these other students, and I'm responsible for you four, I literally could lose my head. But we'll see that Daniel leans on God's wisdom for an answer, as he does throughout the book of Daniel. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given only vegetables. Vegetables there in the Hebrew says food from seeds. So this was fruits and dates and nuts and vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance to those of the other young men who are eating the royal food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So Daniel proposes a test, a short test. Not much harm can happen in those short 10 days, much damage to our health, he's saying. And if we are not as healthy and even better than the others, then I promise you, we will not go on a hunger strike. You got nothing to lose. We will eat the meals that you provide if we're not looking better or as good as everyone else. So the officials see the logic in this and the wisdom in this test, and they agree to Daniel's solution. So he consented to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the steward continued to withhold their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables, food from seeds, and water instead. So these boys consumed a vegetarian, kosher diet, while the other students likely pigged out on the fatty foods and all the wine they could drink. And God blessed the 4 boys with good health and good growth. And as we shall see in verse 17, he also granted them wisdom. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom, every kind of wisdom. And Daniel got an additional blessing. And Daniel had insight into all kinds of visions and dreams. Because these boys had chosen in their heart to honor God, God is blessing them. He's blessing them with this extra measure of favor, of wisdom, which will serve them well in their training and in the execution of their duties. Then Daniel received another special spiritual gift of prophecy, a critical gift again that will be used by God. Next, we'll advance 3 years later, and it's time for graduation and the final exam. And this exam will be administered by the king himself. And Daniel and their 3 companions will be the valedictorians of their quote-unquote graduating class. Let's take a look. Now, at the end of the time specified by the king, 3 years, the chief official presented them, meaning all the students, to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. He tested them. And among all the young men, he found no one equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. So the 4 boys have graduated with honors. And they're about ready to enter the workforce in working for the king. In what capacity? To be advisors to the king and working in a certain department. What is that department? The Department of Black Arts. This is the place, the department where the king goes to speak to and get advice on forecasting, strategy, understanding. This is the place that the king turns to help him make his daily decisions. These are the senior advisors to the king. Pretty powerful position. Let's take a look at the next couple of verses. In every matter of wisdom, and that's key, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, these 4 boys, he found them 10 times, meaning far superior, 10 times better than all the magicians, that's the fortune tellers, and the enchanters, which is astrologers or the wise men of the court. It is an entire kingdom. We shall see that Daniel served the king Nebuchadnezzar for over 40 years and actually served 3 kings after him. In every matter, the verse says, that was brought before Daniel and his partners, their advice was far superior to any other wise men in the king's court. Daniel leaned on God's wisdom for that advice. These men relied on what? The occult. The Hebrew term there for that's used are the same terms that were used in the book of Exodus when we look at the court of Pharaoh. Remember the magicians in the court of Pharaoh. So the king at this time had these type of advisors that used the black arts. They tried to gain wisdom by reading the stars and examining sacrificed animals, the entrails, the guts of animals, or casting lots, or chanting, or using snake charms, a variety of different tools they use in order to predict the future and to give advice to the king. But they were no match to Daniel's wisdom from God. As we'll see in chapter 2, the king so trusted Daniel that Daniel will be appointed over as the chief wise man over all the others. As we'll also see, that didn't sit very well with most of those wise men. And now we close chapter 1 with verse 21. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Remained there. Remained where? He remained in Babylon until the rest of his life. And he remained there until the arrival of King Cyrus. King Cyrus, we'll see, is a powerful, a Persian king that will conquer Babylon in the year 539 BC. At that point, Daniel will be over 80 years old and had lived there for his entire life. He'll live a few more years after that, and actually King Cyrus was so wise, he kept Daniel as his senior advisor. And we'll see that Daniel will live long enough, as God promised, to see that King Cyrus will release the people of Judah from the captivity in Babylon, and they'll return exactly as was prophesied. After 70 years, they'll return back to Jerusalem. That ends chapter 1. We'll pick it up there next week in chapter 2. Until then, may God bless you with good health and happiness. Aloha. See you then.